Charlie Chaplin's first year in films at Max Sennett's Keystone studio in 1914 saw him develop from a music hall comedian into the biggest box office draw the movies had ever seen. By the time his contract was due for renewal, Chaplin knew his earning potential far exceeded anything Keystone could offer, so a departure was inevitable. Charlie recommended his elder half-brother Sid as his replacement. That's Sid playing the cop in Charlie's last Keystone, His Prehistoric Past. Chaplin received an offer from the Essanay company which, unlike Keystone, produced both comedy and drama, a blend that would soon begin to characterise Chaplin's films. Among Essanay's comedy output were the Snakeville comedies, a rustic series which grew out of their earlier films starring Augustus Carney as Alkali Ike, and a young Wallace Beery in drag as the grotesque Sweetie. Best known of all were the Bronco Billy westerns starring G.M. Anderson, who co-founded Essanay in 1907 with George K. Spoor. The company name was derived from their initials. Sennett's policy was to develop comedians, let them go when they could demand high salaries, then nurture another talent to take their place. Anderson instead recognised that Chaplin was like nobody else and could be developed even further. Even at that early stage, Anderson had to make the first approach through Sid Chaplin, who negotiated all of Charlie's deals for the next several years. Initially, Anderson cabled Spoor, saying they could probably get Chaplin for $1,000 a week. Having taken advice to learn exactly who Chaplin was, Spoor agreed. Anderson then found that Chaplin had increased the figure to $1,250 a week. Essanay tried to suggest that Chaplin was not all that popular, a notion Chaplin dispelled at his meeting with Anderson at the Alexandra Hotel in Chicago by having himself paged and immediately drawing a large crowd. Despite Spoor's horrified reaction to Chaplin's financial demands, the Essanay deal was made in November 1914. The company took out full-page ads in both the American and UK trade press in January 1915. Essanay's optimism was far greater than Chaplin's. When Chaplin reported for work at their Chicago studios, a building still recognisable today in West Argyle Street, he was depressed by the climate, a year in California having clearly eroded any resistance to the British weather. He was dismayed further by the company's miserly habit of screening camera negative instead of printed rushes, and by their routinely dishing out scripts on a Monday morning, which Chaplin likened to dealing cards. Chaplin preferred to write his own material and, appropriately, began work on a film called His New Job, with Charlie, also appropriately, seeking employment in a film studio. Having just left Keystone, Chaplin couldn't resist a joke at their expense by calling the fictitious studio Lockstone. By the way, the typist in the background is the then unknown Gloria Swanson. Also appearing in His New Job was Ben Turpin, who had been a resident comedian at Essanay since starring in the studio's very first film 8 years earlier. Other regular members of Chaplin's supporting cast at Essanay included his new leading lady, Edna Purviance, whom he'd recently met socially. Leo White, who often portrayed an excitable French type, continued with Chaplin into his series at Mutual and had a small role many years later in Chaplin's The Great Dictator. Former circus clown John Rand also continued with Chaplin after he'd left Essanay, as did the statuesque Charlotte Minot, diminutive James T. Kelly, and future director Lloyd Bacon. Paddy Maguire had been a regular in Essanay's Snakeville series. Another Briton, Billy Armstrong, was, like Chaplin, a veteran of the Fred Karno Company. His New Job was released on the 1st of February 1915. The next film, A Night Out, was released 2 weeks later, by which time Chaplin had already relocated to Essanay's facility in Niles, California, where the Bronco Billy and Snakeville films were made. Today there is a silent film museum in Niles, close to where the studio once stood at 147 North Hill Street. A Night Out was a reworking of one of Chaplin's first keystones, Mabel's Strange Predicament. In lieu of Keystone's Mabel Normand, Edna Purviance made her first appearance here with Chaplin. She was to appear in all but one of Chaplin's films for the next 8 years. The professional relationship with Ben Turpin did not endure nearly as well. Although a good combination on screen, they did not get on personally, and Turpin's last genuine appearance in a Chaplin film was in a scene separate from Chaplin in the next film, The Champion, where Ben sells hot dogs to a fight audience. The man in front with cap and cigar reacting so strongly to what's going on in the ring is Charlie's boss G.M. Anderson. They were at this time on excellent terms, and 2 months later Chaplin returned the compliment by making a guest appearance in Anderson's film His Regeneration. This routine on a crowded dance floor anticipates a similar moment in Chaplin's much later film Modern Times. It's said that Chaplin never forgot a comedy idea and would mentally file such things away for future use. Up to this point, Chaplin's Essanays had all been 2 reels in length. The next, In the Park, was half that and has the look of a contractual quickie. The park setting had been a standby at Keystone, and this example is a reworking of one of the Keystones, 20 Minutes of Love, albeit with the greater finesse that was swiftly characterising the Essanay series. Although the Essanay films have long been regarded, correctly, as a transitional period between Chaplin's early work at Keystone and the later, more polished series at Mutual, it should be remembered that, at the time, they were seen as the latest offerings from a comedian who just seemed to get better and better. Apart from the more obvious visual gags, audiences in Europe enjoyed his sheer eccentricity and quirky behaviour, as in this moment from A Jitney Elopement, where he absently cuts bread into a spiral. The Chaplin craze, known also as Chaplinoia and more commonly Chaplinitis, had already begun during his time with Keystone, but reached its fullest extent during 1915, particularly among the wartime audiences of Britain and France. Not surprisingly, Essanay exploited this to the utmost, especially in Britain. To emphasise Charlie's presence in each film, the UK releases amended their titles to incorporate the name Charlie. In France, Essanay billed him as Charlot, by which name he has been known to the French ever since. All manner of Chaplin merchandise appeared, ranging from dolls and games to postcards, some authorised by Essanay, with many others drawn by cartoonists in general. Essanay licensed the use of Chaplin in a British children's paper, The Funny Wonder, the first ever appearance of Chaplin in strip cartoon form. Essanay's London representative, Langford Reed, wrote a book based on the screenplays of the films. Chaplin films were being shown in hospitals to wounded servicemen, sometimes with miracle cures ascribed to them. There were competitions for amateur lookalikes and shows featuring professional ones. Chaplin's name and likeness seemed to be everywhere. Not everybody approved of Chaplin, of course. There were those who criticised him for not returning to fight in the war, and there were a great many who thought him excessively crude and vulgar. The rougher elements of Chaplin's comedy were still to the fore in his Essanay films, but these were being complemented by a growing maturity in his work. This first became truly apparent in The Tramp, released on the 11th of April 1915. Having thought he'd won the farm girl's love, then discovering she has a boyfriend, Charlie makes a gentlemanly exit. Back on the road, his dejection turns to optimism about what may lie ahead. This famous ending earned The Tramp its status as the first Chaplin classic. Curiously, Chaplin made no mention of it in his autobiography and attributed this advance in his work to subsequent films. During filming for The Tramp, Chaplin attended a concert at Mare Island off the Los Angeles coast. He didn't even change out of the costume, partly covered in flour, that he wore in the film. This rare clip, showing him pretending to conduct the band, was long misattributed to an event at the New York Hippodrome a year later. The Tramp was Chaplin's last film at Niles. Space had become a problem, so Essanay moved the entire unit, complete with full studio and laboratory staff, to the former Majestic Studio at Fairview Avenue, a short distance from central Los Angeles. The move began on the 8th of April and was completed in the middle of May. During this period, Chaplin shot another one-reeler, By the Sea, on location at Crystal Pier. It's entirely typical of Chaplin that he remembered a gag from this minor film when doing his flea circus routine in the 1952 film Limelight. At this time, Hal Roach, whose own emerging comedy studio was then in hiatus, was directing an Essanay unit alongside Chaplin. Some of the players in the Chaplin Essanays, notably Bud Jameson and, seen here as the ice cream salesman Snub Pollard, would move to Roach's studio soon after. On recommencing independent production, Hal Roach moved into the rather peculiar-looking building known as the Bradbury Mansion. Before that, though, Chaplin used it as the location for his first film following the move, called Work. Work is descended from a stage sketch dating back to Chaplin's time with Fred Karno. It's again heavily dependent on slapstick, but has its share of irony, not least when suggesting the lack of trust shown by the lady of the house can work both ways. This famous gag typifies the boyish vulgarity that endeared Chaplin to many, but also served to alienate quite a few. There were further accusations of vulgarity over the next film, A Woman, released in Britain under the more immediately descriptive title Charlie the Perfect Lady, and similarly in France as Mademoiselle Charlot. The first half is essentially another park comedy, its purpose to set up the second reel, in which Chaplin repeats the seductive female impersonation he'd done previously at Keystone in The Masquerader. It made uneasy viewing for some in an age of clearly defined gender identity. According to Swedish film historian Uno Asplund, the film was banned in his country until 1931. All of Chaplin's Essanays were received enthusiastically by the general public, but from today's perspective we can see that perhaps 2 out of every 3 represented a step forward. A Woman really did not, and the delay in releasing his next film, The Bank, led to speculation on his having run into censorship problems. Chaplin had instead lavished more time in producing his most polished and dramatic film to date. The first glimpse of an emotional depth to Chaplin's screen character had been in a Keystone film called The New Janitor. The Bank uses the same basic story, but, as with The Tramp, places greater emphasis on the hopelessness of a man falling in love with someone above his social position. The genuine drama of the bank robbery scenes also surpassed anything Chaplin had done before. Chaplin took another step back into his past with A Night in the Show. Elements of certain Carnot sketches had appeared in several of Chaplin's films for Keystone and Essanay, but this was a full-scale adaptation of the sketch in which Chaplin had made his reputation. Chaplin made one concession to cinema technique by casting himself in two roles: his stage character of the well-dressed drunk who intrudes upon the proceedings, and the ringleader of a group of rowdies up in the balcony. It's surprising that Chaplin could use a copyrighted Carnot skit, but Fred Carnot had lost a previous court case concerning a 1907 French Pathé film based on the same sketch. The star of that film was, by the way, Max Linder, or Lander, who went on to replace Chaplin at Essanay and became his close friend. Shanghai in some ways demonstrates the middle position occupied by the Essanay comedies in Chaplin's early work. The bank includes a revolving door, which Chaplin did not exploit to anything like the extent he did in one of the later Mutual comedies, The Cure. Similarly, the use of a rocking ship in Shanghai was repeated to far greater effect in another of the Mutuals, The Immigrant. Two recent dramatic films based on Carmen, one made by Cecil B. DeMille and starring Geraldine Farrar, the other by Raoul Walsh and starring Theda Bara, prompted Chaplin to make a parody. Chaplin's Carmen was shown in the customary two-reel length in December 1915, then withdrawn. In April 1916, Essanay released a version expanded into a feature film running 4 reels. This they achieved by shooting additional footage with Ben Turpin, who was never seen in the same scenes as Chaplin, and by reinstating the footage Chaplin discarded, such as gags he did twice while intending to use only the better of the two. For example, this fight scene with Leo White goes on far too long. Chaplin sued over the tampering but lost the case. Perhaps significantly, Chaplin's last films at Essanay, Mutual and First National all showed Charlie leaving prison in some way. The last Essanay, Police, uses the same plot as the G.M. Anderson film in which Chaplin had appeared earlier. Police was released in March 1916, by which time Chaplin had already signed his new contract with Mutual. Anderson too left Essanay at about this time. Chaplin had grown increasingly dissatisfied at Essanay, and when Spohr offered him $350,000 for 12 two-reelers, talks came to an end when brother Sid demanded that Charlie also be paid a bonus of $150,000. Mutual paid Chaplin $670,000 and provided a studio for his exclusive use. So, with the Mutual contract offering bright new vistas, Chaplin bade farewell to Essanay. But they weren't quite finished with him yet. Essanay got more mileage out of the films by assembling some of them into a feature, seemingly long lost, called the Essanay Chaplin Review of 1916. A year later, Langford Reed assembled a similar thing for the British market called Chase Me Charlie. In similar manner to their mutilation of Carmen, Essanay had removed a section of Police before it was released. This segment had actually been shot for an intended feature-length film that Essanay had persuaded Chaplin to abandon, called Life. That and other scenes from this project formed the basis for a further Chaplin-Essanay comedy released in 1918 called Triple Trouble. Essanay claimed to have held the film back, but some critics at least recognised what had been done. In addition to the footage from life, they used scenes duplicated from Work and Police, sometimes printed back to front, with the whole thing framed by new plot footage directed by and featuring Leo White, who by then had left Chaplin and was supporting Chaplin's foremost imitator, Billy West. Perhaps that's why he didn't get another job with Chaplin for more than 20 years. These kitchen scenes were shot in 1915, but the bridging shots in the corridor, using a lookalike for the chef, were added 3 years later. The same applies to Charlie taking out the rubbish. There is no way of identifying Chaplin's arm double in 1918. The best thing about Triple Trouble is that it preserves the Flophouse sequence Chaplin had shot for his intended feature film. When Theodore Huff compiled his long definitive Chaplin filmography in the 1940s, he included this film, while rejecting the many other compilation or bogus appearances that had appeared at around this time. The filmography in Chaplin's memoirs does the same. In each case, it's probably because Triple Trouble contains authentic Chaplin footage that is to be found nowhere else. And with the famous shot concluding both Work and Triple Trouble, the lid finally closed on Chaplin's association with Essanay. The company disappeared soon after, but fortunately Chaplin's films for them are still with us.